They called her Saka, though most whispered another name, the she-bear of the trace. Long before slave catchers, overseers, and cotton kings carved the Deep South into plantations, she walked the Chickasaw homelands as a free woman, a hunter, a wife, and a mother. But in 1837, when the Indian Removal Act forced her people west and tore her family apart, she chose exile over obedience and refused to step onto the removal wagons. The price for her refusal was everything. Her husband was killed, her land was stolen, and her only son, 8-year-old Tama, was sold into bondage on a Mississippi cotton field. Most people broke under such cruelty. Saka did not break. She bent herself around it like iron in fire, reforging every sorrow into strength. She hid among the river bottoms, surviving on venison and bitter herbs, learning every patrol route, every weakness in the overseer's routines. And she waited 3 long years for a moment to reclaim the boy they had stolen. That moment came in the summer of 1840, when 5 overseers dragged Tama into the cane fields for a punishment no child could survive. By the time the sun rose, 5 skulls lay shattered, a Chickasaw war club dripping red, and a mother stood over the boy she had crossed death itself to reach. But her vengeance did not end there. This is the forgotten tale of a woman carved from river stone and thunder, whose love became a legend whispered from Natchez to Memphis. And though the official records bury her name, the stories remain of the Chickasaw woman who brought war to a plantation for the sake of one child. The night the riders came was the last peaceful night Saka ever knew. Summer heat pressed against the cabin like a living thing, thick, humming, alive with cicadas. Saka sat on the floor braiding river grass, while Tama dozed, curled against her hip. His small chest rose and fell in steady waves, each breath a reminder that the world still held something gentle. She heard the horses before she saw the torches, 4 riders, drunk on hunger and greed, pushing their mounts through the trees like they owned the land. They carried papers marked with the government seal papers declaring that every Chickasaw who refused removal was now a trespasser, papers that meant nothing to Saka. She snuffed the lamp, scooped Tama into her arms, and slipped out the back of the cabin. But the riders were fast, too fast. One cut her off, a shadow with a rope swinging from his hand. "Squaw," he spat. "You know the law. The boy's coming with us. He'll fetch a good price." Saka said nothing, but in her silence there was a storm. Tama woke as rough hands tore him from her grasp. His scream sliced through the night, high, terrified, the kind of sound that claws its way into a mother's bones. She lunged, but the man struck her hard across the face with the butt of his rifle. The world flashed white. Blood filled her mouth. They tossed Tama onto a horse like he was no more than stolen goods. "Mama!" he cried, reaching for her. Saka clawed at the dirt, trying to rise, but a boot pressed into her shoulder, pinning her down. The rider leaned low, the smell of whiskey spilling from his breath. "You're lucky we don't take you too." Then they rode off, leaving dust, hoofprints, and a mother with her hands torn and bleeding from the soil she dug at in desperation. When Saka finally stood, the night had gone still. Smoke curled from the torches the men had dropped. Tama's braid ribbon lay trampled near the cabin door. She picked it up and held it so tightly the fabric tore. They thought they had taken her son. They had taken the world's last reason for her mercy. The morning her son was taken was too quiet, so quiet that Nita's breath caught the moment she stepped out of her cabin. The river hummed its usual low song. The crows squabbled in the pecan trees, but something in the air was wrong. A stillness, a warning. Chickasaw women knew such silences. They were the silence before hoofbeats, before soldiers arrived, before the world changed shape. Her son, Hosey, only 12 summers old, had run ahead to fetch water from the creek. He carried a small gourd dipped in ash, as she had taught him, to keep the water sweet. He was humming a Chickasaw cradle song she used to sing when he was too young to walk. His voice faded past the tobacco shed. And then, the scream. Not a child's scream. A mother's scream ripped from a child's throat. Nita dropped the bundle of washed burlap she carried and ran. Her feet slapped the wet earth, her braid whipping across her back like a black snake. As she rounded the shed, she saw them 3 overseers, all mounted, all white-faced with purpose. One had a rifle slung across his saddle, another held a rope, and the third had her son. Hosey dangled from the man's fist like a caught rabbit, his gourd shattered on the ground, water bleeding into the dirt. The overseer's grip was tight under the boy's arm, lifting him clean off his feet. Nita stopped dead, her lungs iced over. "Put down my son," she didn't shout. Her voice was low, the way Chickasaw warriors spoke before they killed. The man on horseback spit. "Ain't your boy no more. Mr. Langford says this one's going east. Good coin for a half-breed. Strong arms for his age." Hosey kicked, clawed, twisted, his mouth forming her name, but no sound came. Terror had stolen his voice. Nita stepped forward, every muscle taut. His father was Chickasaw. His mother is Chickasaw. He belongs to no white man. The man with the rifle lowered it lazily. He belongs to whoever paid for him. Nita's hands curled into fists so tight her nails cut her palms. Her people had already been pushed, beaten, stripped of their lands and names. Many had been forced along the trail of tears, and now these men dared to take her blood. She took one more step, the rifle cocked. A metallic click, cold as a snake's teeth. "That's close enough," the overseer said, and then Hosey screamed again. "Nita, Amma, help me." It tore through her like fire. The man yanked the rope around the boy's wrists, tying him to the saddle horn. Hosey thrashed, but there was no winning against a full-grown man and a horse bred to obey cruelty. The third overseer rode closer and sneered. "You can have another. Women like you breed fast." Nita didn't speak. She didn't blink, but something inside her shifted. A splitting, a cracking, a silent vow forged hot. She watched them ride away, the boy bouncing against the saddle, choking on dust, his small hands bound. His cries thinned as the riders crossed the tobacco fields. The sun glared white on his skin. Then he disappeared into the tree line. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Nita drop to her knees. Not to weep, not to beg spirits, but to feel. Chickasaw women did not cry when their children were taken. They sharpened. The earth beneath her palms was warm from the morning sun. She pressed her hands deeper until she felt cool soil, the kind that remembered things. Her mother had told her, "When you lose something blood deep, place your hands on the ground. The earth will show you what to do." The wind shifted. A crow landed on a fence post, watching her. A sign. Nita stood. Her face was dry. Her eyes were colder than river stones. She walked back into her cabin, and from beneath the floorboards she pulled a long bundle wrapped in deerskin. She unrolled it slowly. Inside lay her mother's war club, carved from black hickory, inlaid with river stones, the head heavy and smoothed by generations of Chickasaw hands. A weapon not for show, not for ceremony, but for ending men. She ran her fingers over the grooves. Her mother's spirit was in the wood. Nita whispered in Chickasaw, "Hosey, hold on. Your mother is coming." She tied the war club across her back, braided her hair tighter, painted 2 bars of red clay across her cheeks, marks worn by Chickasaw women who swore vengeance. By noon, she had left the plantation behind, slipping into the forest like a shadow with purpose. The overseers rode east. So did she. But she would not reach them as the woman they knew, a slave. She would reach them as what she truly was, a Chickasaw warrior whose son had been stolen, and the men who took him would not live to see another dawn. The days after the ambush were tense, though the Chickasaw woman, known only to the plantation as Nola, moved among the fields with a cold precision. Each step she took seemed measured, her eyes sharp and unblinking, scanning for any hint of retaliation. The overseers who survived were either too terrified to speak or had disappeared altogether, leaving the plantation in a fragile, uneasy silence. Her son, little Eric, watched from the edge of the fields, learning the language of shadows and silence. Nola never spoke of what had happened that night. She only trained him to move like the wind, to listen like the river, and to understand the weight of fear without ever showing it. Rumors of the massacre spread through the surrounding plantations. Whispers of a Chickasaw woman who could fell men with a single strike traveled faster than any word carried by horses or mail. Some claimed she was possessed by spirits, that her war club was touched by the ancestors, and that the ground itself obeyed her steps. Planters would lean on their fences, shaking their heads, muttering prayers, and reinforcing doors that seemed to quake at her name. But Nola did not leave the plantation. She stayed, blending into the labor, tending the small plot of corn and sweet potatoes behind the quarters, all while ensuring her son observed the lessons of survival. There was a rhythm to her life, one dictated by the rise and fall of the sun, the flow of the bayou waters, and the ever-present shadow of revenge she carried in her heart. One morning, the master's new overseer arrived, a tall, grim man with a reputation for cruelty that preceded him. He watched Nola with suspicion, as if expecting her to act out, unaware that he was already walking into the echoes of vengeance she had mastered. Nola met his gaze steadily, her arms folded across her chest, a faint smile touching her lips, but her eyes remained steel. She allowed him to inspect her work in the fields, to order her and the other slaves around, and then returned to her small son. "I need you to remember," she whispered to Arik as they crouched by the edge of the bayou, cleaning the water's surface with careful hands. "They see power as muscle and fear as weakness, but strength is patience, understanding, and knowing when to strike. Never forget that, my son. One day, you will need it." Arik nodded, his young face solemn, the memory of the previous night still fresh in his mind, though he barely understood its full meaning. He watched as his mother leaned back, studying the horizon where the sun burned through the early mist. Her body relaxed slightly, but her eyes were always alert. Word soon reached the surrounding plantations that 5 overseers had been killed in a single night, their skulls split as if by some inhuman force. The tale spread like wildfire, morphing with each retelling. Some claimed that the Chickasaw woman had called the spirits of the swamp to aid her. Others whispered that the master had been warned, that he had ignored omens and now paid the price. Nola, however, never sought recognition. She moved like the shadows that draped the edges of the fields, seen only when necessary, never fully understood. Her power was not in the spectacle but in the quiet, calculated certainty that she had protected her son and exacted justice in the only way she could. As the sun set over the bayou, casting long, liquid shadows across the plantation's edges, Nola and Arik walked the narrow paths home, the whispers of the dead lingering faintly in the air. Behind them, the world seemed to hold its breath, the lesson of that night settling into every corner of the fields. The Chickasaw woman had acted, and in doing so, she had reshaped the fear that ruled those lands. The overseers who remained would never forget the night's terror, nor would they forget the silent, unyielding presence of a woman who had claimed her vengeance with a war club and left a scar upon the memory of every man who sought to dominate her and her child. The swamp had witnessed it all, holding the story in its murky waters, as Nola disappeared into the rhythm of her labor, preparing for whatever darkness might come next. Her son, Arik, followed quietly, absorbing the lessons, knowing that the strength of his mother was now the blueprint for his survival and the seed of fear that would haunt every man who crossed their path. The days after the massacre moved slowly, thick as the fog that rolled over the bayou in the early morning. Nola kept to her work with a meticulous attention that belied the violence of her previous night. She washed clothes, tended the small garden behind the quarters, and mended worn tools with hands that were steady, unshaken, and precise. But her eyes, always sharp, darted to the edges of the plantation, alert to any sign that the master or his allies might attempt retaliation. Arik followed her closely, mirroring every movement. Though he was only 10, he had the disciplined awareness of someone far older. His small hands learned to handle the machete with care, to move quietly in the marsh grass, and to recognize the subtle cues in the rustle of trees or the splash of fish in the water. Nola spoke rarely, but each word carried weight. "They will come for us," she said one afternoon as they bent over the soil, turning it carefully to plant corn. Her voice was low, measured. "Some will underestimate, some will overestimate, but all will test. You must be ready, Arik, always ready." The master, fearful yet enraged, began sending men to scout the edges of the bayou. Nola watched each group approach with the knowledge that their curiosity was both their strength and their weakness. The men came armed, sure of their authority, but every glance, every step, betrayed the unease that gripped them. Stories of the Chickasaw woman had spread, morphing with each retelling into something supernatural. Some believed she had been touched by spirits. Others said the bayou itself answered her command. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the line of trees and painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, a group of 5 men approached the edge of the plantation under the cover of dusk. They were led by a new overseer, a cruel man named Willard who had a reputation for brutality. He carried a lantern and a riding crop, and his face was set in a mask of determination. Nola had anticipated this. She had prepared a series of traps along the narrow path leading from the fields to the bayou, small snares and pitfalls that would trip the unwary. She also carried her war club, hidden beneath her shawl, its weight a comforting reminder of her previous night's strength. The men reached the first trap, a simple snare that caught Willard by the ankle, toppling him into the marsh mud with a grunt of surprise. Nola stepped silently from the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She did not rush. She watched as panic spread among the men, their lantern light wobbling across the reeds and water. "Who's there?" Willard barked, struggling against the snare, but the others froze, eyes wide in fear. Nola's voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the marsh. "I am here, and you are not welcome." She stepped forward, revealing her face to the light. Her expression was serene, almost gentle, yet there was a steel beneath it that made the men falter. Her son Arik crouched nearby, a silent shadow, ready to act if needed. The men advanced hesitantly, trying to recover their courage, but every movement played into the traps Nola had set. One fell into a shallow pit filled with water. Another stumbled into the reeds where sharp stakes awaited. Panic consumed them, turning coordination into chaos. Nola moved like water, striking with precision. Her war club connected with a shoulder, then an arm, each blow carefully placed to disable without unnecessary noise. Screams echoed across the bayou, blending with the calls of night birds and the whispering of the trees. By the time the master's men realized the danger, it was too late. They were ensnared, trapped in the shadows of the bayou, their fear magnified by the methodical, unrelenting force of Nola's wrath. Eric, learning from his mother, stayed hidden but ready, mimicking her movements, understanding the rhythm of the hunt and the importance of timing. When the final man fell, Nola stood alone in the clearing, her breathing steady, the war club heavy in her hands. The swamp around her was silent again, holding the memory of her victory. She looked down at Eric, who stepped out from the reeds, eyes wide but unwavering. "Remember this," she said softly. "Power is not in anger, but in knowing when to act and how to survive. You must remember this." As they retreated to the safety of the quarters, the shadows of the swamp seemed to bow, parting to allow them passage. The bayou had witnessed another night of justice, another lesson etched into the earth. Nola had protected her son, defeated her enemies, and left a story that would echo long after the men who sought to dominate her had vanished into fear and mud. The morning after the ambush, the bayou seemed to breathe differently. The fog hung low over the water, curling like ghostly fingers around the cypress trees. Nola and Eric rose before dawn, moving quietly through the quarters, tending to the small garden and repairing traps that had been sprung the night before. Each careful step, each deliberate motion, was a lesson for her son. Survival was not just about strength, it was about foresight, patience, and knowing the land as intimately as one knew one's own body. Word had spread quickly through the neighboring plantations. Men whispered in hushed tones about the Chickasaw woman who had taken vengeance on the overseers, the ones who had long tormented the enslaved. Some called her supernatural, others called her ruthless, but all shared the same fear. Nola was untouchable. The master of the plantation, a gaunt man driven half-mad by fear and pride, sent word to anyone who would listen, promising riches and retribution for anyone who dared bring her down. But Nola anticipated this, and her preparation was meticulous. She had spent weeks watching the movements of the plantation's patrols, studying the behavior of the bayou's wildlife, learning how to move silently across mud and water without leaving a trace. Eric followed her like a shadow, absorbing every lesson, every cautionary tale, every whispered warning about pride and hubris. By mid-morning, the first patrol arrived, 5 men striding confidently down the path toward the quarters. They laughed, dismissing the rumors, their weapons glinting in the weak sunlight. Nola, crouched behind a thicket, watched. Her hands tightened around the handle of her war club. Arik, small but nimble, mirrored her stance. The men reached the first snare. It caught 2 of them by the legs, flinging them into the marsh with shocked yells. Nola stepped from the shadows, her presence commanding, her voice calm and precise. "You think this is a game?" she asked, eyes scanning the others. Her stance was relaxed, almost casual, but every muscle was coiled for action. The leader, a tall man with a cruel grin, laughed nervously. "We've dealt with troublemakers before. Step aside, woman. We mean no harm, just take your son and hide." Nola's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in controlled fury. "No one takes what is mine," she said. Then, with a motion like lightning, she swung her club, striking the leader across the chest. He collapsed, knocking 2 others into the mud in the process. Panic erupted. The remaining men stumbled, tripping over hidden stakes and shallow pits. Arik darted through the reeds, helping to disarm and incapacitate, learning instinctively how to read fear, how to turn it against those who wielded it. Nola moved with lethal grace, every strike purposeful, every step calculated. By the time the chaos subsided, only 1 man remained standing, frozen with terror. Nola approached him slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Go back to your master," she said, voice low, almost a whisper but carrying across the marsh. "Tell him what happens to those who hunt the innocent. Tell him I warned him." The man scrambled backward, muttering prayers and curses, disappearing into the fog with the echoes of the bayou swallowing his cries. Nola turned back to Arik, who had returned silently, eyes wide but unshaken. "You see, Eric," she said, her tone gentle now, almost maternal. "Power is not in brute strength alone. It is in knowledge, patience, and the will to act when the moment is right. Never forget this. Never let pride blind you." They returned to their quarters as the sun climbed higher, the swamp alive with the calls of birds and insects. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had paused, acknowledging the survival and triumph of the 2 who had walked among its shadows. The master's patrols would come again, certainly, and the threat was far from over. But Nola and Arik had turned the bayou into their domain, a place where fear and skill intertwined. And as she looked down at her son, who mimicked her every move and listened with unwavering attention, Nola knew that they were no longer merely surviving. They were shaping a future built on strategy, courage, and the unyielding bond between mother and child. The swamp was no longer a place of fear. It had become a sanctuary, a training ground, and a warning to those who underestimated the spirit of the Chickasaw woman who refused to be broken. The day broke with a strange stillness over the bayou. The sun struggled to pierce the low-hanging mist, casting a silver glow on the black waters that lapped lazily against the cypress knees. Nola rose first, her hands instinctively checking the traps she had set the night before. Eric, still sleepy-eyed, followed, his small frame moving with the quiet precision she had taught him. The boy was learning fast, and she allowed herself a brief flicker of pride. He would not be helpless the way so many children of their people had been. From the far edge of the swamp came faint voices, low, deliberate, and careful. Nola paused, listening. She knew those tones. She had heard them countless times in whispered rumors and half-breathed warnings. A group of men approached, no more than 6, but each one deliberate, confident, armored with weapons and arrogance. They thought themselves untouchable, sent by the master to punish the woman who had humiliated his overseers. Nola crouched by a thick stand of reeds, letting Eric take cover beside her. She felt the weight of the war club in her hands, familiar and comforting. Her eyes scanned the terrain. The men were moving in a predictable pattern, and she had already planned their undoing. As they drew near the shallow channel, Nola motioned to Arik. He nodded, understanding instinctively. This was a lesson not in brute force, but in strategy, patience, and timing. One wrong step could cost them dearly, But their advantage was knowledge of the swamp, its hidden currents, its deep mud, the treacherous undergrowth that could claim the careless. The first man stepped onto a false footing trap, a concealed pit lined with sharpened stakes. He fell with a startled cry, arms flailing, while Nola lunged with the club, striking the second before he could react. Arik, nimble and quick, darted between the remaining men, tripping them with hidden snares and striking with a small, sharpened knife Nola had given him. Panic erupted among the group. Their confidence cracked as the swamp itself seemed to fight against them. The air was thick with the cries of the fallen, the splashing of mud, and the low growl of Nola's command. She moved like a shadow, striking with calculated precision, avoiding unnecessary blows, aiming to incapacitate rather than merely to kill. But these men were not as inexperienced as the last patrol. One of them, taller, broader, with the kind of reckless bravado that came from wealth and power, lunged at Nola, attempting to knock her off balance. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him into one of her hidden pits. The sharp stakes bit into his leg, eliciting a howl that echoed through the swamp. Arik, seeing the opening, sprang into action. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it with all his strength, bringing him down to the ground. Nola moved in swiftly, striking his back with the war club until he lay still, breathing heavily, but alive. Survival, she reminded herself, was about teaching the boy the difference between vengeance and justice. The remaining men, now terrified, attempted to flee. Nola pursued, moving with silent grace through the swamp. She forced them toward the edge of the marsh, where deep mud and the network of snags and roots made movement treacherous. One by one, they sank, their struggles slowing until they were trapped, helpless, and entirely at the mercy of the bayou. Nola's eyes never left them, and Arik's small hands mirrored her actions in controlled, precise movements, ensuring none could escape. By the time the sun broke through the mist, warming the stagnant water with feeble light, the swamp had claimed all but one of the men. He sat on a fallen log, gasping, mud up to his knees, eyes wide with terror. Nola approached him, calm, unwavering, her war club resting lightly on her shoulder. "You will tell your master," she said, her voice low and steady, "that this swamp is mine now, that we are not prey, that any who come to harm us will meet the same fate." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Go back, speak only truth, and do not return." The man scrambled away, slipping into the trees, leaving Nola and Arik alone in the misty quiet. The swamp was still again, save for the gentle lapping of water and the distant call of a heron. Nola lowered her war club, exhaling slowly. She looked down at her son, his face illuminated by a shaft of sunlight breaking through the fog. "You see, Arik," she said gently, "strength alone is not enough. Knowledge, preparation, and the will to act wisely, these are what make one untouchable." He nodded, understanding more than words could convey. He had learned from the mother who had raised him to be fearless, cunning, and resolute. The day stretched ahead, warm and heavy with the scent of swamp water and earth. Nola allowed herself a rare smile. They had survived, yes, but more importantly, they had asserted their dominion over a place that sought to devour them, and Arik, watching his mother, understood that survival was only the beginning. Power, in the hands of the right mind, could reshape even the darkest corners of the world. The bayou slept uneasily that night, the moon's reflection trembling in the shallow waters, as if it too feared the shadows that moved through the cypress knees. Nola had kept watch while Arik slept, his small body curled against her side beneath a blanket woven from reeds and rough cotton. The events of the day had left her muscles sore, but her mind remained sharp, scanning every flicker of movement beyond the clearing. She had survived countless threats before, but the pattern of the world told her that power, once demonstrated, invited attention. By dawn, the swamp was alive with whispers. The birds carried news of the bloodied intruders. The insects hummed in uneasy symphony, and the water seemed to carry a low murmur of triumph. Nola rose, letting Arik stretch and awaken. He had grown fast, taller than she expected for his age, with his mother's sharp eyes and a steadiness in his hands that belied his youth. Today, she decided, they would take a more active stance, not merely surviving, but ensuring that no man would think of threatening them again. Their first task was to fortify the small shelter they had carved from the swamp's natural recesses. Nola showed Eric how to layer branches and mud to disguise entrances, to channel sound away from their hiding places, and to build false trails that would lead any intruder into pits or quicksand. "A clever mind is stronger than brute force," she told him, demonstrating how a shallow trench could be the difference between life and death. Eric nodded, already thinking of improvements, suggesting a series of tripwires that could topple a fallen tree over a narrow channel. Nola smiled faintly. He learned faster than she had hoped. By midday, they heard it. A distant horse's hooves, steady and deliberate, cutting through the swamp's soft mud. Nola's lips tightened. These were not the same men who had fled yesterday, but reinforcements larger, armed, and more determined. She signaled to Eric, who dropped behind a curtain of hanging moss. The swamp had become a weapon in their hands, and they would use it as such. The first two men entered the maze of hidden trenches, unaware that they had stepped into a meticulously crafted trap. The mud sucked at their boots, pulling them off balance, while hidden spikes tore through their ankles and shins. Nola's war club found the first man before he could recover, swinging with precision and force honed over years of labor and hardship. Eric, nimble and silent, guided the second into a pit camouflaged beneath brush, ensuring the man's descent was both swift and irreversible. The remaining intruders spread out, attempting to flank them, but the swamp betrayed them at every turn. Nola moved with supernatural grace, striking only when she could guarantee control, teaching Eric to do the same. Each man fell to mud, water, or club, screams echoing faintly through the trees, swallowed almost immediately by the swamp's oppressive atmosphere. By mid-afternoon, only one remained tall, broad-shouldered, and snarling in disbelief at the carnage. He aimed his pistol at Nola, but the swamp seemed to pulse against him, a living entity guiding her movements. She ducked behind a tree, swinging her club in a deadly arc that struck his side and sent him sprawling into a hidden channel of murky water. Eric joined her, throwing a rope over the man's limbs to secure him without killing him outright. They needed leverage, not mindless slaughter. Nola knelt beside the man, her hands firm on his shoulders. "You will return to your master," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, yet carrying the weight of the swamp itself. "You will tell him that this land is ours, that no one will take what is ours, harm the innocent, or expect mercy." She pressed a small, sharpened piece of cane into his palm as a mark of their dominance, a token to remember the swamp's reach. "Go, speak truth, return, and you will live. Lie, and this place will devour you." The man's eyes widened with terror, and he scrambled through the muck, tripping and sinking into shallow pits, until he disappeared among the trees, never daring to look back. Nola stood, watching him vanish, then turned to Eric. His eyes shone with pride and fear, the dual lessons of their day firmly etched into his memory. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Nola and Eric sat by the water's edge, exhausted yet unbroken. The swamp was silent, save for the gentle lapping of water and the distant cries of birds. She looked at her son, realizing that he had become more than a survivor. He had become a guardian, a partner, a force to be reckoned with. The bayou itself seemed to acknowledge her power, its waters reflecting the fading sunlight like molten gold. "We have survived," she murmured, her fingers trailing through the warm water. "And now we ensure no one forgets." Eric reached out, touching her hand, understanding the depth of her words. That night, the swamp lay calm. For the first time, Nola allowed herself a moment of true reflection. They had transformed the bayou from a place of terror into a shield, a fortress, a domain where the weak could learn strength and the oppressed could claim power. The echoes of the past, the cries, the threats, the injustice were buried beneath the water and mud, replaced by the pulse of their own dominion. Tomorrow, she would continue her work, training Eric, ensuring the swamp remained untouchable. Tonight, though, she allowed herself to rest, leaning against the soft moss, her war club at her side, knowing that for the first time in her life, they were truly free. And freedom, she realized, was a lesson that extended beyond survival. It was a mastery of the mind, the body, and the spirit of the land itself. The moon rose high, silver and serene, casting long shadows over the dark waters. And in that quiet light, Nola whispered a vow to the bayou and to her son. "We are its children now, and it will never betray us." The swamp seemed to breathe in answer, and for the first time in many years, the night was at peace. Years had passed since that night in the bayou when Nola and Arik had turned the swamp into a fortress of vengeance and survival. The land, once a place of terror and oppression, had been transformed into a sanctuary, hidden from the eyes of the cruel world outside, yet alive with the stories of triumph, resilience, and cunning that Nola had instilled. The tall cypress trees, draped in moss, bore witness to every lesson she had taught, every trap she had set, and every intruder who had dared to trespass. The bayou itself seemed to hum with memory, a living testament to the legacy of a mother and her son who refused to be broken. Arik had grown into a formidable young man, strong and clever, carrying Nola's wisdom like armor. His hands were steady, his eyes alert, and his heart guided by the lessons of patience, precision, and courage. The swamp had taught him more than survival. It had taught him power, respect for the land, and the necessity of strategy. Nola had watched him with quiet pride as he mapped out new routes through the bayou, designed more elaborate defenses, and even began to train others, escaped slaves who had found refuge with them, passing down the same teachings that had preserved their lives. The stories of their victories spread silently along the river routes, whispered among those who had known hardship and dreamed of liberation. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the bayou guardians, a mother and son who could strike with the speed of lightning and vanish into the waters, leaving only the evidence of their justice behind. Many had tried to track them, but the swamp was a labyrinth, a living entity shaped by Nola's hands and reinforced by her meticulous mind. Each trap, each false path, each hidden pit was a testament to her genius and a warning to any who thought to challenge them. Nola herself had grown wiser with age, her one eye sharp as ever, her movements fluid and measured. The scars of the past had hardened into lessons, and she carried them with grace and ferocity. She would often sit on the banks of the bayou at sunset, watching the water shimmer like molten glass, reflecting on the countless men who had underestimated her and paid the price. Her hands, though calloused from years of labor and defense, could move with incredible precision, whether to set a trap, guide Arik, or simply draw patterns in the mud as she contemplated their next steps. The swamp, once a place of fear, had become a place of growth. Arik learned not only combat but also the knowledge of the land, the plants, the water's flow, the secret passages hidden beneath overgrown roots. He became an adept navigator, an alert guardian, and eventually a teacher himself, ensuring that the wisdom Nola had imparted would survive long after they were gone. The two of them operated as one entity, a seamless blend of instinct and strategy, a combination that made them nearly invincible within the swamp's confines. Word reached even the planters and lawmen in nearby towns. The bayou was no longer merely a hiding place, it was a fortress. Tales of sudden disappearances, found only as muddy footprints or empty campsites, fed into the fear of the unknown. Many believed in rumors of voodoo or spirits protecting the swamp, but those who knew the truth understood that it was Nola and Arik human, relentless, and brilliant, who orchestrated every defense. The mystique of the swamp only worked to their advantage, ensuring that no one dared approach without fear gnawing at their confidence. But beyond the power and fear, there was a deeper legacy. Nola had not merely trained Arik for survival or revenge. She had trained him to live with dignity, to protect the vulnerable, and to turn despair into strength. In teaching him, she had passed on the true inheritance of freedom, the ability to control one's environment, to anticipate danger, and to wield power responsibly. They were no longer slaves. They were masters of the swamp, of their fate, and of the lesson that the oppressed could turn the tables when ingenuity and courage aligned. As years wore on, the swamp grew denser, more labyrinthine, and even more impossible to navigate for those who sought to challenge Nola and Arik. They took in other runaways, built trust, and formed a small but formidable community, teaching every individual the lessons of the swamp, its defenses, its pathways, and its secrets. Those who once trembled at the sight of a field hand now trembled at the mere whisper of a mother and son who had defied death and transformed the swamp into a domain of unmatched power. On the anniversary of the first ambush, Nola and Arik would sit together by the creek where they had first marked their sovereignty. She would recount the story, step by step, never omitting a detail, and Arik would nod, remembering the precision, the patience, and the courage it had taken. They would smile faintly at each other, knowing the bond they shared was deeper than blood. It was survival, triumph, and an unbreakable legacy. And so the swamp endured, a living monument to resistance, protection, and cunning. Travelers and merchants continued to whisper of the bayou guardians, and though many attempted to find them, none ever succeeded. The land remembered, and in its memory, Nola and Arik's legend lived on proof that intelligence, bravery, and unyielding determination could transform fear into security, weakness into strength, and oppression into freedom. Nola, watching the sun dip below the horizon with Arik at her side, knew that they had achieved what many thought impossible. They had rewritten the rules of survival and claimed dominion over a world that had sought to break them. And as the stars reflected upon the still waters of the bayou, she whispered a promise that no matter what storms might come, no matter what men might try, the swamp and those who respected its lessons would endure. In the quiet that followed, with the moon casting silver paths across the water, Nola finally allowed herself a full exhale. They had survived, they had conquered, and they had created a legacy that would ripple through generations. The swamp was theirs, the story was theirs, and the freedom they had carved from the hands of oppression would never be forgotten. The bayou sighed in contentment, and for the first time in decades, its waters were peaceful, reflecting not just the sky, but the enduring spirit of two who had turned despair into an unbreakable empire. The swamp that had been silent for decades now carried whispers of a story too sharp for normal speech. Word traveled from riverbank to cabin, from the log walls of distant plantations to the crowded markets of Natchez. A Chickasaw woman, fierce and unbroken, had struck down 5 overseers with nothing but a war club and a mother's wrath. The tale was raw with horror, yet threaded with awe. It was a week after the final overseer fell. The plantation had emptied, save for a few trembling field hands and the hushed women who dared not meet each other's gaze. The air smelled of damp earth and burned wood where the last overseer's cabin had been set alight. Shadows lingered in every corner, as if the very soil remembered the screams and thuds of that night. The woman, known to few by name, walked silently along the creek where she had hidden her son. His small form clung to her skirts, frightened but safe. The boy was trembling not from the cold, but from the horror and disbelief that their freedom had been carved in blood. His tiny hands, still raw from grasping branches and pulling at mud, held tight to his mother's, feeling the pulse of strength and defiance that had carried them both through the ordeal. Neighbors whispered of her in disbelief. A woman, alone. They faltered, unable to finish the thought without shuddering. No man of any weight or sword had dared approach her after that night. The county constable had fled, leaving his papers and badge behind, and a quiet lawlessness settled over the area like a shroud. But the Chickasaw woman did not linger in fear. She knew the story would reach ears eager for vengeance. She taught her son to move silently, to understand the rhythm of the swamp, and to read the signs in birds and branches. Her war club, worn and nicked, hung by her side, a reminder that survival was never passive. One afternoon, a carriage approached from the main road, breaking the rhythm of the swamp's quiet. 2 white men, one young and brash, the other older and cautious, emerged, lanterns in hand, their faces twisted with curiosity and barely concealed fear. They had heard the stories. Of course, every man in the county had. But to see her with their own eyes, alive, walking freely, defied their understanding. "Ma'am," the younger one stammered, bowing with unnatural stiffness. We come to speak." She did not look at them directly. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the swamp's edges. Her son pressed against her side, shivering. "Speak," she said quietly, voice calm, but carrying a weight that could topple men. The older man swallowed hard. We want peace. We don't want trouble." Her lips curved slightly. "Peace?" she repeated. "You call the death of 5 overseers trouble?" The brash one shifted nervously. We mean no more violence. We will pay for the crops lost. We'll leave you and the boy alone. Please." She studied them a long moment, considering. Her war club never left her hand. She weighed words against action, fear against prudence, memory against the present. Finally, she spoke, her tone low and even. "Leave by sundown. Tell the others. No one crosses this land again." The 2 men nodded frantically. One tripped over a root, another cursed softly, and together they scrambled back to the carriage, muttering to themselves, their fear etched into every motion. The Chickasaw woman watched until the lanterns disappeared into the distance. Then, she turned to her son. "You see?" she said. "Strength isn't only in arms. It's in knowing when to strike and when to hold. Remember this." Her son nodded, absorbing each word, each lesson, each shadow of the swamp's wisdom. Night fell. Stars reflected on the creek's surface, untouched by fear, unmoved by the terror that had once held sway. The Chickasaw woman rested her war club beside her and took her son into her arms. The swamp breathed around them, silent and protective, as if acknowledging that justice had been served and that her courage had carved a space where no man could follow. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of water rippling over mossy stones echoed the heartbeat of a mother who had defied everything, and the beginning of a boy who would grow under her unyielding strength. The legend was no longer whispered. It was carried in the soil, the rivers, and the wind. Any who entered the Chickasaw woman's domain would remember not only the power of her arm, but the force of a mother's love and the consequence of underestimating the unyielding spirit of those who have nothing left to lose. The swamp had claimed justice, the mother had carved freedom, and the boy, safe at last, would inherit a story no overseer, no man, no law could ever erase.